Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on your locations. Good to see everyone here. Obviously, we have a guest speaker with us today, so I'm just going to kind of say a few words at the beginning here, and then we'll have some time at the end to go over a couple things for class. And actually, in Austin, let's come back if you want to re-ask your question too, because I want everyone to hear it at the end to talk through the process. Thank you. So first, just off for the setting your intentions you all submitted. Those were fantastic. Thank you. I hope that you hold yourselves accountable to what you set forth for the coming weeks and months. I do recognize there's a lot going on and, to keep track of classes just starting. So if anyone didn't get a chance to submit yet, please do so ASAP. As soon as possible. But I do know most of you got it in there, so thank you for that. And we will leave some time today at the end to go over any questions kind of on the syllabus, just the process. If you got to dig into the syllabus, think of any questions you might have if you looked over the assignment instructions. We'll go over all that at the end. But first, for the bulk of today, we are really privileged to have with us Dr. Betsy Taylor, who will be discussing action research cycle and her work in social and participatory research methods today. Dr. Taylor is a cultural anthropologist and the founding director of LICAN, the Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network, which is a nonprofit think tank for policy relevant research toward post-carbon livelihoods and communities. Over the past 25 years, Dr. Taylor has worked for community-driven development in both Appalachia in the United States and in South Asia to integrate issues of health, agriculture, forestry, culture, and environmental stewardship. She writes about environmental and social justice movements, democratic planning and participatory research, women's issues and commons, democratic reclamation of academe and professions. She's co-authored a book, Recovering the Commons, Democracy, Place, and Global Justice, and we are deeply honored to have her here with us today. Dr. Taylor is going to talk about some of background context of her work, of LICAN, about her work in the context of social research for social change, and talk through some ideas around the action research cycle. And then we'll have time for questions that you all posed ahead of time. Thank you very much for those. I collected those and sent them along. And then also just think of any questions that you might have emerging, right? That it doesn't have to be within the confines of what you posted the other day. So with that, I will turn it over to the lovely Dr. Taylor.
Thank you so much, Julie. And I really enjoyed your questions. I had one plan yesterday as to what I would say, and then I read your questions and I've kind of reoriented because they do get to the heart of a lot of the challenges we face. So what I've done is kind of a coding of your questions to pull out kind of big themes in them. And so I just quickly wanted to go over what I think I'm hearing from you. And then I thought it might be most helpful if I could kind of zero in on particular questions and just throw out some examples, because the heart of participatory action research is this deep belief that reality happens in places with particular people in their everyday lives, and that once you immerse yourself in those concrete, on the ground realities, it's actually a very powerful position from which to look at like the whole world, reality itself. So it's often hard to explain what makes for good PAR research. It's kind of like, dancing. It's like learning how to dance you just have to start to get a sense of how it works. And then if you try and explain to somebody how to do a dance, it gets like really complicated. You say you put your foot here and your hands here, and it's just not the same thing as that kind of special flow and art to doing it. So it's hard to communicate often how to do this well. But one of the most powerful ways is to use parables, to use examples to learn from. So I'm hearing from you all three big kinds of questions. First of all, a number of you seem very concerned, and this is incredibly important, with the question of how, well, let me step back quickly. In the chat, you should see that the first link, and I hope everybody can see it, because I thought rather than me doing a lot of screen sharing, I would just make this link available to you so you can kind of explore. So the first one is the Lichens PAR training guide, and you are welcome to jump into it. We have various methods there and kind of background ideas. And then the second one is the Lichen PAR research cycle. And so if there's some way that you can pull that up on your screen, I will be referring to that a lot, but rather than share it on the screen, I'll just let you pull it up. And so on one hand, the strength of PAR is that it does give multiple methods to set up complicated research teams with a lot of different types of people with very different kinds of skills, very different kinds of perspectives, and to actually produce, knowledge that is helpful and geared to real life problems. So that cycle that you can see, can everybody pull up the cycle? And I don't know if, yeah.
So it's on that, that second link, if you scroll down just a little bit. Yes. On the PR research cycle link.
And so what that shows is that there are stages. Well, let me just zero in on that cycle and pull it up for myself to make sure I've got it right. Yes, so, and this is what you're learning in this course, is how you need to be very rigorous in thinking about the stages that you need to go through in terms of defining goals and research questions, which a number of you asked about, stakeholder assessment. That means who is impacted by the questions, that the issues that you're working on, who has a stake in this, and so whose perspective and knowledge could be brought in, and then based on that, build your research team or your project from that. And then once people are at the table, really refine the research questions that you're asking. And then from that come the reality-based ways to decide what methods will work and what kind of data you need to gather, and then how to do the analysis. And then very importantly, and people often forget the last phases, figure out the best ways to communicate to the folks who have some kind of stake in the situation, to do it in a way that's safe and empowering, doesn't hurt anybody, but really makes a difference in terms of finally achieving the action and policy outcomes. So that cycle is really powerful. Let me just, but it is a kind of a self-contained process that you need to be pretty rigorous about. But a number of you were asking questions about how that fits into the wider fields of power and change. And Carissa Grocia, you asked about the ethical issues. And Austin, you asked about scaling up. So that's where we end up really having, if we're going to end up with good action goals, all of this research should be done within a real power analysis of the wider fields of power that you're in. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Then the second big category of questions you seem to be asking is about the capacity and bias issues. So Lidette and Robert and Fabienne, you asked about, with local communities, you have biases and you have questions about capacity. And then you have questions about capacity with the experts that you're working with. People are they get these disciplinary blinders on. They can't see outside of how they've been trained. And once people get some kind of degree, they get kind of cooked, they get very fixed in their perspective. So so that was the second big issue I heard. And then third, this question about how to include, who to include when and how in the research cycle, like who's there to frame the research questions. Melchiade asked about that. And then Maher, very interesting question about the time dimension of the communities and including different age groups. And then June, did I say it right? June asked about, did I say it right? June? Yes, okay. Asked about local power imbalances, and several of you talked about that. And then also how to fold secondary research in. So great questions. I'm going to start with this, the first question, which is so important about the wider fields of power and how to make sure that your more focused research is contextualized in a real theory of change. And theory of change is a phrase that you'll hear a lot in civil society. I don't know if you all use it, but basically it's starting by doing a mapping of power relationships that are relevant to what you're doing. Have you all started to work at all with power mapping? Have any of you done power? It's a kind of PAR technique called power mapping. So basically, I can explain it best with by using my hands. Basically, within power mapping, it's a very powerful PAR technique that's widely used. And you sit down with folks and make sure that they have some kind of material that works for them. So when I was working in Northeast India and Arunachal Pradesh, most of the women's groups didn't have skills of reading and writing, but we would kind of create, actually on a table, sort of almost like board games, where we would have, they would put bits and pieces of things that represent different issues for them, and then we would kind of use that instead of writing. Or if you're working with people who are literate, then you can use things like Post-it notes. We use a lot in the US, where you can, sticky notes, or people can write in the earth or the with magic markers, whatever. And basically you take some kind of like a big sheet of newsprint or something, and on one side you put the power relationships in the community. People represent existing power relationships, and often at the lower end you have folks who are kind of marginalized from official power, and then going on up at the top of the chart to the folks who are more visible and have more power. So on one side you have the existing picture, and then on the other side you look at where the community wants to go to in terms of changes in the power relationships. And then in between you can put in institutions, people, or interests that are more neutral. They're not, they're potentially can be involved. Anyway, so then you use this to have a discussion of where people want to go, and then how to get there. So it's a strategic planning tool, but it's very focused on power relationships. And so so this is a useful tool. And I have to say, a lot of the PAR techniques that have, from the 70s, 80s, 90s, when people were really developing a lot of these techniques, a lot of it was done in places like Northeast India, Kerala, Southern India. In Appalachia, we used them. And many of the communities where PAR really worked were ones where in that community, people might be low income, they might face various problems, but they had local communities with quite a bit of existing mutual support systems, that there were real in the community resources for people on their own to build their community and chart their way. And in so many of the most successful early participatory research projects were in areas where people already had pretty strong communities. So I just want to give an example from Northeast India, where this is an area with an incredible diversity of tribal groups. And when I first arrived there, I was working with a wonderful, actually it was Future Generations linked Indian nonprofit, and they were setting up women's groups in about 6 of the tribes. They were very different tribes. And so I was coming in to help with the training, and it was just a wonderful project. And it was mostly focused on community-based healthcare. And when I first arrived, all of the government officials, the Indian civil service people said, oh, well, the tribes that will be most successful are the more advanced ones, the Apatani. And they said, but the tribe you'll have difficulty with in getting anything started, the Nishi, who were more isolated. And when we started the work in the Nishi villages, the women, they were villages where warriors were very powerful. So there was a lot of male dominance, but the women were the local, they were the horticulturists. They had the gardens. They actually had a lot of raw economic power. And so on the surface, from the point of view of the government officials, it looked like the women were very disempowered, but the women were kind of a sleeping giant in that area. And so what happened is, in the first meetings, it was men turned up, and then when they realized they weren't going to get jobs or money, they didn't keep turning up, and it was the women who just kept going and going. And so we were working with the women on some really wonderful, they essentially became women's groups. And in the women were kind of like a sleeping giant. There was a sort of outburst of empowerment among those women. They very quickly set up, they became sort of the leaders across all of Arunachal in terms of reaching out to other tribal groups. So that's an example of ways in which this sort of thing happens in a very dynamic kind of setting where, communities are in flux and the needs are in flux. And I do want to emphasize, I'm going to pause now to open this up for conversation. One of the great strengths in the Future Generations model is this idea of seed scale, because built into the Future Generation seed scale model for a theory of change is this focus on the importance of always paying attention to the three-way partnership between government officials and community, and then also the people with technical expertise. You could call them experts or intellectuals or media folks, people who can provide particular skills. So it's that three-way partnership, and thinking about your theory of change in terms of that terrain of relationships is very, very powerful. I want to make one last point about this now. I was saying that a lot of the PAR has worked because in the communities, there was already a kind of strength that was almost like a sleeping giant. You know, people were sort of looking, they were ready to kind of jump on into this, and brought, you know, various skills of leadership. So in the Arunachal situation, we quickly, like the second year, um, and this is a key part of really keeping the research cycle going, so it's continually empowering and scaling up. Um, all of the teaching was then done. So the first year there was like a cohort of folks, of women almost entirely, who had been very active in setting up the training programs and the research, assessing childhood mortality and the effectiveness of different kinds of public health programs, and then also some small scale income generation. And they, by the second and third year, those women who were the early adopter, or, you know, early participants, then became the teachers. And they became so much more effective than you know, middle-class professionals or you know, people from elsewhere could be. And I just want to give one example, which I really loved. We were, you know, we had some pretty dynamic projects in 3 of the areas, and then going up into an area that was closer to the Tibet border. And so all of the training was being done by women from the other areas. And they came up with the most powerful metaphors to explain things, things I never would have thought of. So they were much more effective in the teaching. So it was things like, we were trying to explain the idea of empowerment. And this one woman from a niche area said, she said, it's like, you know, you drive into town and somebody comes in with their big fat Jeep, you know, sort of pointing at the government people. And what's the first thing that happens? Well, one dog will start barking, right? And then they said, and then you wait. And then another dog starts, another dog. And so she said, that's what empowerment's like. Everybody starts barking. And it was like, I never would have thought of that, but it really worked as a way to communicate. So yeah, I want to make one more point on this question about how to mesh your actual PAR work into broader theories of change. As I was saying, a lot of this work has been in communities that have traditions of community building and often mutual support, self-help. But now, in a lot of the communities I'm working in Central Appalachia, which is an area that's been very damaged by extractive industry, there's been a kind of collapse of community, a kind of blight, we call it. There's a lot of substance abuse and addiction problems. Families are very affected. Often it's grandparents raising the children because the parents are incarcerated or facing issues of substance abuse. And also new social media, you know, Facebook and all of the new forms of communication are fundamentally changing the sort of landscapes, the social and the human landscapes we work in. They can be a very powerful tool, but I think this is a big frontier for us to be thinking about much more than we have been in terms of what PAR works now, given the issues that we're facing. So I'm going to pause on this and just throw it open for any comments or reflections from you all on this issue of how to contextualize your work in broader fields of power. And I'm sure you'll be working on this question a lot in this course.
And this is where to encouraging folks to think about either, you know, like we talked about last week, where, you know, I found it interesting of most of you put that you hadn't been engaged in PR kind of work, right? And then you started checking off all the things that you've done, right? That were that very thing. So thinking about, what you've done in the past, and also the work, what I've asked you to do for this course is not necessarily design something totally separate, but engage with what you're doing in the place that you are too, and weave this into um, the current community work you're either doing already or looking to do, right? Of to get started.
Well, if I may. Hi. Good morning, Dr. Chair. Thank you so much for your thoughts. There are things that that you said that really connect. I am particularly impressed. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your experiences with different communities. I love what you said about, in I guess I'll paraphrase in my words, is as though you go into a place that is completely unknown ecologically and culturally, and yet all you have to do is keep your eyes open and also listen. And that's probably the first thing to do, versus come in and fix things. And I'm wondering, how long did it take you to adapt that, or did you ever meet a culture clash that really put that to the test?
That is like the most important principle in all of this. And what we always say is the first thing you do is listen and then ask what is already going on, right? Because often the folks that are going to be the dynamite spark plugs of your work are folks who don't necessarily think of themselves as doing this work, So we were called into Eastern Kentucky and Harlan County, which is an area that's been where there's been a lot of coal mining for like 120 years, and the watershed's very damaged. And so we'd started with some folks who really wanted to study the water, and then then I asked, as I always start, I said, well, has anybody been thinking about the water? It turned out there were 2 little towns in there where the people on their own had gone house to house and done a survey without thinking they were doing a survey. But they had done detailed sort of oral histories in these 2 towns. And so I said, did you write it down? And they had like boxes in their house. So I don't think I've ever been someplace where there hasn't already been something going on if it's an important issue. And then another time and that's why, first of all, it's really important to build up one's techniques of listening, and it's hard. And a lot of professional education teaches you how to have like closed ego boundaries and not listen and not be open. So it's really important, like with your whole team, to support people to just hang out and listen and talk and go to where people feel really comfortable, so that they feel like they can speak out. But well, actually, Julie and I were just in a wonderful conversation with some folks thinking about working with communities in the U.S. And with young people. And one person said, I work with young people who are afraid of the sound of their own voice. And that would be true of many communities. So that's where the communication side of this is so important, is making sure that the flow of, so it's both the entry into the work and hanging out in a very open way in communities to find out what's already going on, but also really from the beginning trying to make sure that where this ends up really builds people's capacity, their voice, the voice of the key constituents, above all, create spaces that are durable spaces where they can keep expressing themselves. And I think it's tricky, because to really do this well, it takes a long time. It takes years. And for me, I think some of the most effective work that we've done is when we've been working for a number of years and build up trust and support, local building, supporting leadership, local leadership and local institutions. That said, it's also important to be brave and go into new and different settings. So yeah, I think that is, I think the main secret is to find the social settings where people feel comfortable to really speak honestly. And we have had trouble in some parts, in areas in the US, well, in Appalachian areas where there's the local leaders are very powerful, and often it's hard to even find meeting places where you can get a range of people to sit down together and work together. So listening to what's going on, and then also finding the settings where people feel just really comfortable and where the diversity of voices can unfold. And sometimes that means you need to have like meetings with the women, so they feel, if there's a lot of male dominance, so you have sort of different spaces that fit the needs of the particular project. Jun.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I asked it on their website, Moodle, but I really don't know how to start, but it's a bit confusing. The main question is, what is it? I mean, it seems you emphasize that we are the non-researcher, a designer, or projector, NGO worker, but as a facilitator. I like that word, but sometimes even I emphasize that facilitator to my the colleague, but sometimes we use that word. I mean, how to facilitate, even we can lead them to some direction. So it's a tricky. What's the role of as a facilitator, as a real facilitator? Because honestly, as an angel worker, I ask that question. We survey, research it using the second data first. So we analyze them first, and then we bring the goal, the proposal to bring into that. Even approach, we a bit make some strategy before we address them. So already it's not pure pure approaching. And I don't know, I'm not very sure the power mapping issue, but sometimes we deliberately lead them, facilitate them, because when we gather all the community people, there are the vulnerable people, like children and women. Normally they can speak out in front of other whatever. So we organize, stop. Can we give the chance to the children to speak up? Something like. But if you really want, so it means we facilitate, we lead them, we organize them. It's not freely talk and just So my question is, in an end of the day, we have to make some action. So my question again is, what is our role? Actually, they never invite us before we understand. So what role we have to, what contents?
There are many levels to what you're talking about. One level is a pretty technical one though, and that is how to conduct meetings. So if key parts of your work are going to happen in meetings, then it is incredibly important that any team members who are actually conducting meetings are really trained in how to do that in a way that's culturally appropriate and really fits your, the goals of the project. And I think, so in our work, we do put a lot of emphasis into training people in how to facilitate, because any kind of collaborative work you're doing requires those skills. And some of that has to be, in some ways, they're sort of universal. I think they're almost cross-cultural universals on that, in terms of how you listen and taking notes in an appropriate way and getting skilled at that. People really need to practice, because one of the things that's hardest for communities, and if we're looking at that research cycle and we say, who brings the best capacities at each stage? One of the things that communities often is hard for communities is to document what they're doing, to take notes on the meetings, to write reports, to summarize things. And so if you have a rather large project where you're trying to listen to multiple communities, sometimes you need people who are trained facilitators and can move through and really distill what's coming out of those meetings. But the danger is that if somebody's calling meetings and coming in with a certain professional status, the danger is that they will drive the direction of the dialogue, which I think is part of what you're saying, right? Now, again, there are some techniques that can kind of push it. That's always happening. So that's like, water running downhill. The power imbalances, the professionals, they'll always be sort of pushing things. It's like a current in the ocean, and you have to fight against it. Some of the methods do help. I mean, as far as I know, the first use of photo voice, which is a popular PAR technique, is where community folks with their cell phones or some other way they capture photographs. That started with school children, I think in Philadelphia, and the teachers, for various reasons, gave the children cameras, very cheap cameras, and the children went out and they gave a view of their schools that no teachers saw, because this was in a very dangerous area with a lot of crime. And they, on their way to school, they documented all the, the drug dealing and the other things they were passing by. It was an incredible project. And, from that point, they changed the perspective of the teachers and the principals. So I think making sure that one is, so, okay, I just want to give one other example that we're actually working on right now, that if you really are trying to deal with the actual power relations around your project, and that if that includes a three-way partnership with government and NGOs or, in the community, there's a lot of translation that has to happen. So we're involved in we're just starting a project in Eastern Kentucky, again, an area where the watersheds are very damaged and the public water systems are collapsing. This is where parts of America are verging on being a failed state. So we're working with multiple communities where the water is getting more expensive. They can't use their natural wells. And Lichen is convening government, scholars, water scientists, and community representatives. And what we're going to do is we're bringing in some anthropologists who are going to listen to people's those three sectors, each one of their perspectives on what the problems are, and then summarize their view, and especially focus on communicating to the experts, the water scientists, what the community perspective is. So we're kind of playing now, I mean, community folks will also be at the meetings, but they don't necessarily speak up. So we will play a kind of translational role around, and then also translating the water science. And I can be sharing some of what's coming from that to the local communities, because actually a lot of the modeling that the water scientists are developing don't work at the local level because they're lacking local knowledge. You know, the local people, because they have this long time perspective, actually know a lot more about some of the features of the water system. And so that really impresses the scientists when they're shown up as not understanding certain things. But the other thing, again, facilitating the meetings in the right way is crucial. Just to give one example, we've done the community and the scholars from the University of Kentucky had done a very good household survey of water and contaminants and health. Local people gathering the data, and the university folks analyzing it. And then we did a report back. We had a trial run on the report back, and it started out very strongly with some of the very empowered local leaders giving the framework, and then they talked about the research. That this was a report back digitally to the community. And then it became, at the very end, the last scientist to speak summed it up, and they said, "Any questions?" And so I immediately called the scientist up and I said, "No, your voice can't be the last voice. It has to go, the last voice has to be a community representative." When we actually did the real report back, that changed the whole tone. And that's a very simple thing, but just a little bit of facilitation like that can make a huge difference.
I think one thing I just wanted to add to that too, and that was an awesome example, Betsy, thank you, was also the framing of facilitation, not so much as leading, like I heard you say the word lead a few times. Yeah. So it's not in a leading role, that it's often creating space, and it's creating multiple spaces in diverse ways, right? And that's where a lot of the listening comes in too, because I think the example you gave, June, right, where are the kids speaking up, or as Betsy talked about, are the women able to speak? So it's also listening and understanding and learning what various types of spaces to be created, so that there is the ability for whomever would like to engage. So it's not leading it, it's more of doing that facilitation to create kind of the atmosphere for folks to be able to come together for their voices to lead, because that is really challenging, right? Of people often feel like they don't have their own voice to share. But when even, there's all kind of dynamics, even very simply, sometimes having a meeting that's just women, that changes everything. For if you had women embedded in meeting with everyone else, or if you have there's always dynamics across generations, right? And understanding in that specific context what's appropriate. Do you bring people together across the generations? Should you have a specific elders meeting? All of those different kinds of dynamics. And so that's where it's listening and learning from what that, from what you're being told. In a sense, being told, it can sometimes be just coming to understand, right? And then in being involved to help create those spaces. We unfortunately realize we only have a couple more minutes with Betsy, with Dr. Taylor. And I was hoping you might address, if it's okay in the last couple minutes, just because of the vast wealth of experience you have in, in carrying out participatory and social research, that is there any kind of, nugget of wisdom that might be hard to boil down, that you've kind of learned in your journey that might be helpful for those who are either just starting off or who have been doing this and looking to gain some new knowledge and skills?
Well, let me focus on an area that I feel like for years I paid too little attention to, and increasingly am focusing on it. It feels like it's just becoming more and more important, is really thinking throughout the research cycle about how to communicate well what's coming from it in a way that is really meaningful to the core constituents and participants. And so, I'm increasingly, it's feeling like art and music and drama and ways to really get the findings out in multiple media is just very important and not paid enough attention to. So that's a lesson learned for me. I feel like I've been weak on that, or in some of the work I've done, it's been weak on that. And storytelling, and realizing how much knowledge is in things that don't look like research,
I appreciate what you shared earlier too, and thinking about these methods that have been developed some decades now, and now with these kinds of shifts in communication and social media, and what that does, and how maybe of thinking about the kind of methods to be developed that speak to that kind of new communication world that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. And also thinking about, so a lot of people think participatory work as being more work with communities, but if you think about the three-way partnership, really transforming government services, that this can be a very important part of building respectful collaborations with government people who are often these days very under-resourced and facing very difficult problems without support. So I think it's not a technique only for, community development projects in communities. It's also, many of these methods work really well to translate between different disciplines within scholarly groups, or in trainings, and or for government officials. But I really enjoyed your questions, and it sounds like you've got some fascinating projects going. And then
does anyone have just any kind of last quick question? Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Taylor, for a good presentation. In participatory action research, PAR, community, to know community definition is very important. Being a student at Future Generation University, in a city scale, we define a community as a group of people who share something in common and able to act together. I would like to know if the community in what we said in PAR has the same sense, or is another, can it take another sense in that methods? Thanks.
That's a really challenging question. And it's becoming particularly challenging now that, you know, so much of human interaction is on social media and Facebook. And so we've got new kinds of digital communities. I'm a little old-fashioned on this, in the sense that, so I think that the future generations definition is a good solution to a complicated problem, how to define the communities. I think I worry a lot in trying to draw the boundaries around communities about who you're accountable to. I remember one meeting, again, this was in Eastern Kentucky, where the folks were talking about who's local, and they said, you're local if you can't drive away from the problems, right? You're kind of stuck, right? We have this expression in America, when the chickens come home to roost. It's like where did the consequences of this end up? And for me, the reason I keep doing more place-based work in communities that are place-based is because if you're dealing over long periods of time in places, then the consequences of things come back, and you can often see who's accountable and who's affected. Now, that's my approach. But my main concern, when people are doing like Facebook communities, I worry about whether there's whether there's always accountable, and there will be. Does that make sense?
Okay. Thanks. Okay.
That was a great question, and I think and that the word that Betsy used there, that Dr. Taylor used, you know, is also thinking about accountability, right, which becomes critical, and that you know, there is the place-based context, but that communities aren't bounded always geographically, right? That often that gets kind of used together, community equals geographic place, right? And that's really important too, especially for places, say historically, if people have been pushed out, right? If some people have been forced to leave, or, you know, for whatever reasons, or if, you know, they've been kind of pulled for, you know, jobs or economic reasons, but so what ties people together? What are, you know, either what kind of relations, what kind of belief systems? Those are things that create community. And then there is very much the place-based context. And often you'll find that that community has some sort of place connection, but it doesn't have to. And that's where, especially these kind of social media kind of communities that come on board, right, that Dr. Taylor was speaking to, really complicate matters in a sense of being grounded in where that accountability lies, because there isn't necessarily that kind of grounded place connection to come back to. So it raises a lot of ethical dilemmas, if you will, and looking at those kind of spaces.
And place is so weird, because just to give one example, I was actually born in India, right, to parents who were American. And I don't know how my mother did it, but somehow she put this love of her family home place into my heart, even though I only periodically spent time there. So I feel a deep place attachment to Appalachia, to those mountains and that home place. I don't know how she did it. I mean, literally, I'd just spend summers with my grandparents, but it was, so I was born I spent half my childhood in India. I'm very attached to India. So place is weird, you know, and being place attached yeah.
My mom did it by making sure every single sentence she could work in as to, well, this is how it is at home. If you do that 1,000 times a day over 20 years or so, it starts to stick.
And that's why culture is so important. Culture and storytelling and ways of talking is just crucial. Being alert to that.
I recognize we just have a few minutes left, and I do want to talk to you all about some class processes. So let's give Dr. Taylor a huge thanks for her time and energy for being here with us. She left. Oh, I'll see you in half an hour, Betsy. Bye. We're preparing for kind of a big meeting together soon. So for there's a lot of, so for what's coming up, so the way, and Austin raised this question at the beginning, I want to reiterate here because it's a great question of, it's a little bit confusing. This doesn't work how like a lot of kind of courses do, where the way that our week is laid out, if you think of it a little more of like Friday to Thursday, where if they're like the end of it is kind of this Zoom session together. So after this session, what you're doing is you're starting the reading for that next week. And then you have the assignments due by Monday night university time, and then our Thursday Zoom session. So that's kind of the rhythm. So it's always consistent in terms of, you know, that you'll have reading, that any assignment will be due Monday night university time. And then I say 11:59 p.m. just because midnight is always confusing as to what day you're really talking about. So Monday night, and then our Zoom sessions on Thursday. So that'll be the rhythm pretty much throughout. For next week, you have, I double checked there. So everything on the Mahara page, on the course Moodle page, if like there's any links to click, like say for this coming week, there's a video I'm asking you to watch. There's a link to Community Toolbox. I'm asking you to just read, and there's a lot of sections on this. It looks like I'm asking you to do a lot. Each of those sections is like a page. So if you see your reading for next week, it's like, wait, I have to read all 24 sections. Wait, what? It's really, and this is like, I'm not expecting you to read this word for word. It's just, these are just kind of a whole, it's a great tool. I think it's one of the best examples of like Community Toolbox of kind of ways to do different methods. And so I want you to click through them all, because some are going to speak to you, some are not. And so I'm anticipating more of the ones that call to you, that you know, you'll read through a little more carefully. Others you might just skim over. So that's kind of more a resource for you. Not that I'm expecting you to read it word for word. So that's, things like that are more resources for you to go back to, not like, okay, I'm going to quiz you on this thing this week or something like that. But anytime you have links to click to, go to the Moodle page, because that's where all like the links are and all the, you know, videos are uploaded. So you should be able to access everything just fine that way. If you do have any issues, please let me know. And then you have your assignment for this coming week is Monday night. There is a community discussion forum where there's a question posed in the community discussion forum for next week that I'm asking you to respond to. And then also, you know, you can see if others have responded, and, you know, you might want to reflect on, you know, share thoughts a little bit together, but I also want your own, you know, put forward your own reflections as well. So saying that, are there any kind of questions emerging at this point? Okay, there's a couple of questions. So for anyone who filled, so it looks like pretty much everyone I think has filled out the Google survey. It's not going to show up on the course Moodle. This isn't for a grade or anything. Basically, I had set up a Google form, a Google survey, and I know it was a little unconventional asking folks to do it before the class started. It was more for me just to kind of get a sense where you all were at, and so if I might change things around depending, you know, on how that was filled out. And so the responses all come up separately. It's not linked to Moodle in any way. So if you filled it out and something's not showing up on Moodle, like, don't worry, you're good. I do have your responses recorded, and it's not like I'm not grading this or anything. It's more for my information to kind of, you know, understand a little where you all were at. So yeah, thank you for filling those out. Any other questions?
Sorry, I'm not familiar with the community discussion forum. Is it posting through the Moodle site?
Everything's through Moodle. Yeah, so all assignments. So, and I'll send out a reminder email as well. So you go to Moodle, you go to that coming week, and it'll have the readings for the week. It'll have any, you know, if you're supposed to watch any video, and then it'll have whatever kind of activity or artifact that you're submitting. So say for next week, it has a community discussion forum that you click on that, and that's what you'll submit to. Sometimes it'll be, might be an assignment where maybe you're, writing something to put up there, but it'll always be right on that week's page or that week's section. Are you seeing it up there? June, is it showing up for you? June, are you able to hear me? Is it showing up for you on Moodle?
Yeah, mine is working.
Oh, okay. Because sometimes, because I have a little bit different view, so I don't see it from the student view. So if you ever don't see something, please let me know, and I will get into it and see what's going on. So yeah, I know it feels like a little clunky at first, but as kind of we get going here, it'll hopefully start to make some more sense. So yeah, all right. Well, thank you, everybody. Any questions arise, please feel free to email me, and I will see you all next Thursday. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.